welcome to Turf Wars Season 4, Episode 3. This week is going to be a special episode because I am away this week. So I've pre-recorded this and edited together a special episode. So some of you may or may not know, but on Boxing Day 2022, which is the day after Christmas, the 26th of December, for anyone who's not British, I just looked this up, and apparently Boxing Day is from the 1700s, the term, and it was the day when rich people gave their servants a box with Christmas gifts in it. So isn't that exciting? Everything in British dialect is something to do with rich people treating poor people badly. Anyway, on Boxing Day, I went to the LBC radio headquarters and did basically a special episode of the Transatlantic Call-In Show on Natasha Devon's show. So LBC is one of our biggest radio stations in the UK. It has millions of listeners. It's quite a big deal, which was quite scary and quite exciting. We basically just did a call-in show. So it was me and Natasha. Natasha's a cis woman who's quite supportive of trans people and trans rights. And the topic was mainly about the Scottish Gender Recognition Act, which might be a little bit out of date now, but I think it was still interesting to hear what people calling in, because most of the calls weren't really related to the Gender Recognition Act. I mean, nothing to do with the Gender Recognition Act. People don't know what it does, they don't really care. All of this is just general concern about trans people. So it's interesting to hear what the general public had to say about trans people and what their concerns were, rather than like the kind of people who call into the shows that I usually do, which maybe sort of self-selects for people who are more interested or want to find out, or more combative, or trans people who already know what they're talking about. So yeah, I thought we could listen to the interview, but in the original radio program, there was obviously lots of ad breaks. So I've cut all of the ad breaks out, and after each section, when there's an ad break, I thought I could react to what I was thinking at the time and talk through the answer I just gave. So it'll be broken up, and we'll come back to me talking about it. So I'm not just going to press play and disappear. And some of the callers were pretty wacky. I won't spoiler it, but some of them were wacky, and it's going to be interesting to listen back, because I haven't listened back to this since it happened. So yeah, we're going to cut away to me talking to Natasha Devon.
As mentioned, we've got something a little bit different and special for you in the final hour of the show. So you will no doubt have seen last week that Scotland passed the Gender Recognition Reform Act, and they now join Argentina, Belgium, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Denmark, Ecuador, Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, New Zealand, Norway, Pakistan, Portugal, Switzerland and Uruguay in not requiring a diagnosis of gender dysphoria in order for a trans person to obtain a gender recognition certificate. What does this mean? Well, trans campaigners say it will give them dignity and make their lives easier. However, the law has enraged so-called gender-critical campaigners who say it will put women and children at increased risk. I've invited an expert campaigner, feminist and trans woman into the studio to answer your questions and concerns about the new bill. Give me a call, 0345 6060 973.
So that was the first section, and I haven't actually spoken yet, but I think this is really good. So Natasha's obviously done some research. Whenever people talk about the Gender Recognition Act in the UK, they always say, self-ID, and they don't really explain what it is, what it does, or importantly, where else has it. She just listed off all these other countries that already have self-ID. And that alone, I mean, when people realise that, they're like, there's like 18 other countries, or 19 now, which have this. So where's all the problems in those countries? And that gets you already thinking, maybe all of this is just kind of nonsense. So that's a good start. And another good start, which I did ask them to do this, but I think Natasha would have done it anyway, and was, I think, quite good, is mention that I am a feminist. She said, she wasn't calling me an expert, but called me a feminist and LGBT rights campaigner, and I always think that's important to point out, because all of the arguments I'm making about everything to do with LGBT rights come from a feminist position, and it's a feminist worldview that I'm making these arguments from. And the British media particularly always likes to do this kind of trans people versus feminists thing, when the majority of the people who oppose trans rights are anti-feminist, and the majority of the people who support trans rights are either feminist or like people who don't really know about feminism but are feminism sympathetic. So it's a good start. Haven't said anything yet, but it's already good. Anyway, let's do the next bit.
It is coming up to 3 minutes after 3. Natasha Devon with you until 4 o'clock this afternoon. And as promised, we've got a really special hour for you. It's a little bit different to the types of phone-ins that we would usually have on LBC, but I think it's going to be an interesting and important hour with your contributions and help. And we're discussing the fact that last Thursday afternoon, the Holyrood Parliament voted overwhelmingly and cross-party for Scotland to become the first part of the UK to introduce a system of self-identification that's going to allow Scottish citizens to change their legal gender without a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It will also allow 16 and 17-year-olds to apply. Previously, the threshold was 18. It's really important to understand that Scotland are not the first country to do this. They're just the first country in the UK. So they are now joining Argentina, Belgium, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Denmark, Ecuador, Ireland, Iceland, Luxembourg, Malta, New Zealand, Norway, Pakistan, Portugal, Switzerland and Uruguay in not requiring a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Now, campaigners who are for the change have said that it will help trans people to live with dignity, but there is still more work to be done. Namely, the biggest things, reducing waiting times for medical treatment for trans people, which currently exceeds 5 years, and that the whole of the UK should include trans people in their definition of conversion therapy practices. But there's also been significant backlash, and there were protests in Holyrood when this was voted for. And critics have said that it's going to make women and children less safe by allowing predatory men to get a gender recognition certificate and allowing them to access women's spaces. Now, I've done quite a lot of research into this issue, so I believe that these concerns are largely unfounded. I definitely don't feel any less safe as a woman. I wouldn't if I was a woman in Scotland. I'm a cisgender woman, which just means that I'm not trans. However, I look at the coverage in things like the Times and the Telegraph, and I think if I didn't have a special interest in this, if I hadn't taken the time to do my own research, I can see how I would be concerned. I would be worried. I think I would try and both sides it if I hadn't taken the trouble to do my own research. So that's why I've invited Katie Montgomery into the studio, who's not only an expert in this area, but is trans herself, so speaks from a position of experience. And I wanted to invite you to call in with your questions and concerns. And Katie, welcome.
Hi.
You've said to me when we were off air, there's nothing that people could ask that would offend you, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do a weekly call-in show for trans rights anyway, and we take all kinds of callers, and I like to I think lots of people have just never talked to a trans person before, and they're worried about, saying the wrong thing or upsetting me or something. And I think it's good to not just go up to a random trans person you meet on the street and ask them a question. So I'm giving you a free pass to call in and say something you might be a bit worried about being offended, and I can just correct you. If you say something and I can just be like, well, don't say that to anyone else. But yeah, I'm kind of nearly bulletproof on this, hopefully.
Well, the number to call if you do want to ask something to Katie is 0345 6060 973. I'm really happy that you're here. And you did offer to come on the show today, and I was more than happy to take you up on that offer. But I wonder, knowing how contentious this issue is, I mean, this is the cornerstone of the culture war, really,
right,
this stuff. Do you feel safe always to talk about these issues publicly?
I mean, it depends. I feel safe, like, on the streets, my hometown and where I go, and I feel safe in that I'm quite confident and I just discuss it with people. But I guess I do worry about the kind of anti-trans pushback. It gets very extreme, and as you get more prominent as a trans person, you get sort of dedicated haters and stalking websites, and I've had all of that stuff, and it is kind of horrible, and I do just kind of try and put it out of my mind. But some other sort of trans rights activists of similar or slightly larger profiles than me have been, targeted for things like swatting, which is where they sort of call in a fake bomb threat to your house or something, and the police turn up at your house in the middle of the night. And So it is kind of scary. But at the moment, I feel okay generally.
I'm glad to hear that, because I think it is a really brave thing to put yourself out. You have what's called passing privilege in the LGBTQ community, which means that out on the street no one would know that you were trans.
Yeah.
So to put yourself out there online and offer up that part of your identity and offer to have a discussion about it, I think is a very courageous thing to do. So thank you for being here. One of the trans campaigners that spoke at Holyrood said, this is a step in the right direction, but it's far from job done. And what it might do is increase the visibility of trans people and put them at greater risk.
Right.
Is that a concern for you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess with all kind of civil rights movements and pushes for equality, first you need some kind of visibility. You need politicians and the public to listen to you. And then that happens, and that kind of started happening for trans people around the 2010s. We finally became a thing where you might see a trans person on TV or, being discussed in the newspapers and the magazines more than just like a, throwaway story in a magazine or whatever. And that was good, and that's a good thing, because then people are listening and you can say, these are my problems, we could fix this. But then inevitably that comes with the pushback, and the pushback because, most people are cis people. All the politicians are cis people, all the people working at all the newspapers are cis people. That means that we don't have as much of a voice. So the pushback is just enormous and very disconnected from reality, I think.
Yeah, indeed. And most of the polling does show that the majority of cis women support trans people's rights. However, because of the tidal wave of negative press, that is starting to shift in the other direction, which is partly why I invited you here today, because not only do you have the lived experience, I see you on social media just correcting people about some of the misconceptions, many of which they've picked up from the tabloids. So let's get to the switchboard, which is already filling up. Alison has called from Lincolnshire. What would you like to ask?
Hi, Natasha. Hi, Katie. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I mean, as I always say, I've got skin in the game. I'm trans. So that's the first point I've got to say. But I always say, is all these reforms that are going through, right? The gender critical lobby are saying it's going to affect cis women, their access to single spaces and all that sort of stuff. All of that is what we already have. We've had it for decades. I keep saying, and I always ask the opposing voices, where is your evidence that this reform of our marriage certificates, birth certificates, death certificates, where does this impact the cisgender community? If having the access change to those documents was going to have a detrimental effect to the cisgender community, why haven't we seen it for the last 20 years?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, all this fear is over the wrong thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think this is the biggest misconception. If you look at the newspapers, they're all saying, oh, self-ID, self-ID, and you just hear this phrase self-ID and you think, what does that mean? And then they start talking about women's spaces, which are important, like everything from toilets all the way to like women's shelters and prisons and stuff. And people just kind of put those two things together, or a lot of the media just straight up lies about it. And some of the politicians are just saying, the Gender Recognition Act will affect women's spaces, but it just factually does not. And, you're right, to call in to say this is the biggest thing. And lots of people say, oh, well, I'm a bit worried about, women's spaces. And that's okay to be worried about those spaces. But the reality is we can just look at the UK and loads of other countries and say, well, actually, like the current law that covers whether trans women can use women's spaces is the Equality Act 2010. But before that, there was another law in 1999, there was a law in 1975, and so on. And there's never actually been a situation in the UK where trans women aren't allowed to use women's spaces. So we've just always been there, like your entire life, just using them alongside you. And we haven't had issues. I mean, statistically, it's not a problem. And it's not just the UK, it's countless other countries. So, yeah, I think that is my first thing as well that I always want to say to people is, I hear what you're saying, but this just isn't related to the gender recognition certificate. So we can talk about that separately. But also, the point you're raising is we can look around and say, well, it's actually turned out okay. We've already done it.
So, sorry, just to reiterate, I did mention this earlier, that cisgender just means not transgender, which is, it's, I guess, the gender equivalent of saying straight, straight person. So the argument, and I made myself read some of the comment pieces in the Times and the Telegraph today. The argument they make again and again and again is that what self-ID means is that a predatory cis man who wants to attack women can self-identify as a transgender woman and will therefore automatically be allowed unquestioning access to things like domestic violence shelters. Why is that wrong?
Right. So, I mean, it's worth just looking at what this act does. So the Gender Recognition Act allows you to get a gender recognition certificate. And this certificate, sorry, this is a little complicated. This certificate allows you to update your birth certificate. And if you think about in your life, when you've had to use your birth certificate, that's all the times it's important for us. So this isn't when you're going into the toilets. It's not when you're, going to a woman's shelter. It's not when you're doing anything in your day-to-day life. It's things like the first time you apply for a passport, or when you want to get married in some places, not everywhere in the UK, but a lot of places. It affects what's on your marriage certificate. It affects your death certificate. And that's basically it. And just a clarification on the passports, it's like your first passport. If you've already got a passport, then you don't need your birth certificate, and you can change the gender on that via self-ID already. That's already the process we've had for years and years. So to say, a predatory man might exploit this, well, that to me is like a predatory man might exploit this to get married as a woman or to have F on his death certificate. It doesn't give them any benefits. And that is why we haven't seen this. And like you just listed out 18 or so countries, and none of those are having this issue where someone is changing their birth certificate to then somehow something end up in a women's shelter. And that's because we already have laws for women's shelters and for prisons and other, important places to think about safety and who needs to be in what spaces. And these in the UK are covered by the Equality Act 2010, and that allows, it's already been allowing trans women into those spaces for, over a decade now. So we've already had trans women in women's prisons, all the women's shelters in the UK, except trans women already. But there's room in the Equality Act for them to, on a case-by-case basis, make an assessment, and they won't be in legal trouble if they say, well, sorry, in this situation we're going to have to provide alternate service or something for an individual trans person. And so that's why, this talk, you can say, oh, I'm worried about predatory men, and that's fine to say.
Everyone is.
I mean, that's fair. And I am too. I've been sexually assaulted before and, followed home by some weirdo. And it's terrifying. And you get that feeling when you think of this and you're like, yes, I totally agree. And then they say, and this allows anyone to just do it. And you're like, oh, you put those two together and it makes you panic. But the thing is, all of the other stuff, all the important stuff, which spaces we use, what our passport says, what our driving license says, what our bank details say, everything, that's already law. That's already been the case for, in some cases, my whole life. And so we can say any worries about those things, we already know. That's fine. They've already been resolved. And it's just this last little bit. And it is just fear-mongering.
Thank you. If you've just joined us, we are hosting a phone-in with feminist campaigner and trans person Katie Montgomery, who's here to answer any questions or concerns you might have about what happened in Scotland last week with the changes to the Gender Recognition Act. A lot of noise about this in the newspapers, but how much of it is based in fact, I guess, is what we're trying to determine.
So the first caller was quite good. I mean, this is kind of, whenever a trans person calls in to talk about the Gender Recognition Act, on any call-in show or on the news or when they're interviewed on like BBC News or something, I totally feel like just screaming, that isn't what the Gender Recognition Act does. And I feel like that's what the first caller was doing, was saying, like, finally, here's a show where I can say this and someone's not just going to lie about it back to me. So, yeah, I'm glad. And it can seem a little bit repetitive when I feel like I say to people every single day, like, that isn't what it does, that isn't what it does, that isn't what it does. We've already got self-ID in spaces, we've already got self-IDs, but, like, we do need to keep saying it and people need to hear it because that's the reality of it. And that is the only reason that anyone has to push back against the Gender Recognition Act reforms. I guess other feedback, maybe I'm being hypercritical because it's me. I hate listening back to myself. I feel like I'm a bit like, but maybe I'm always like that and you're all like, Katie, you're just rubbish at talking. And also, like, I don't know, did I structure those arguments in the best way? Who knows? I won't be too critical. I think it was okay. It was a good warm-up caller, I guess. I was kind of hoping for a competitive one to start because that really gets my brain going. When someone calls, like, on the Transatlantic call-in show, when someone calls in and they're like, oh, I really like your show, I was just wondering if I could have some advice or something. I'm just like, oh, yeah, okay, right, let's give some good advice. If someone calls in and they're like, I want to, whatever, to trans people, and my brain's just like, and like, adrenaline rush, I'm in the zone, I'm going to make a strong argument now. So, anyway, thank you to that first caller. Let's listen to the next one.
It's 3:19, and if you've just joined us, we are joined in the studio by Katie Montgomery, who is a feminist campaigner, somewhat of an expert on these issues, and also a trans woman. And I just wanted to take the opportunity, because there is so much about the decision that was made at Holyrood just under a week ago, Christmas, lost all concept of time, about the changes to the Gender Recognition Act. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to speak to a trans person and an expert on this with any questions or concerns that you might have. And Bob has called from Hastings in East Sussex. What would you like to say?
Hi, good afternoon. I'd like to ask anybody or everybody, what do you say to someone like me who has almost no concept of gender?
When you say you have no concept of gender, do you mean internally, or do you mean you don't know what we're talking about when we say gender?
Mostly, simply, I don't know what you're talking about when you say gender.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, fair enough. I think the most basic way I would describe this to someone who's, or an alien even who's just landed on Earth and doesn't know what's going on, is I would say, very crudely, or maybe saying to a child, and I don't mean to make this sound patronising, but some people are boys and grow up to be men, and some people are girls and grow up to be women, and that's true for most humans on Earth. But we also have some people who want to change from one of those groups to the other. So some boys change to girls, or some girls change to boys, and some men to women, and some women to men. And that's kind of the basic of it. But then we also have awareness of some people don't really feel like they fit into either of those. So they might go somewhere, they might consider it the middle or somewhere else at all. And we often have this word non-binary, which we use to describe that. But there is a whole range of different things. But I think for most people, basically the answer to the question is, I would say to you, are you a man or a woman, or how would you describe yourself? And you'd probably say, oh, well, I'm a man. And then I'd be like, okay, cool. And that's kind of the situation I'm in. If you were to ask me that, I'd say, oh, well, I'm a woman. And you could just be like, oh, okay, that's cool. And that's kind of all it really means for most people, I think.
Did that answer your question, Bob?
Well, I only wanted to mention something else, if I may.
Okay.
So there's this thing called the Statute of Marlborough of the year 1267. And this is the oldest parliamentary statute still in effect, or at least I've read this, I'm reading it now, and it says, ordained in an assembly of discreet men, both high and low, there's a gap there, put in writing to be observed by the inhabitants of the realm forever.
Okay, and how's this relevant to the conversation that we're having?
Well, if I said I'm male, but I'm not particularly worried whether I'm called a man, that expresses all I know about gender.
Okay, well, Bob, thank you for your call and for asking that question. I think the way I describe it to people, because I tend to have a different sort of conversation. There are people in my life that they're an inch away from getting it, but not quite. And I talk about the distinction between sex and gender. And sometimes people say to me, oh, so people's gender is just a feeling then.
Right.
It's just a feeling. And I normally say, well, no, it's an orientation in the same way as your sexuality is. You would never say that being homosexual or heterosexual is just a feeling, would you? We understand that's how some people are.
You could describe it like that, but it seems a bit confrontational to say, oh, well, your sexual orientation is just a feeling, get over it. And that's rubbish. I think that, I guess the first thing I'd say to that is this kind of, there's a difference between sex and gender can be I mean, that's true, but it can kind of be misleading where people get this idea that sex is like set in stone and then gender is like, you know, whatever's going on in your brain or just a feeling or anything. But sex is just your sex characteristics, which is just a combination of different things, you know, from your genitals to your hormones to your gonads and all these other parts of you. And some of them can change. So then that's often part of transition for a lot of people. So that's, you know, one thing to factor into this. But in terms of gender or gender identity is like the kind of analog word to sexual orientation. It is more fundamental than a feeling. And I think the best way I used to describe this to cis people is imagine if, you know, like a wizard or, you know, an alien or some kind of magic changed your body. If you're a man listening to this and it changed your body to that of a woman, or if you're a woman listening, it changes your body to that of a man, would you just then suddenly just be like, okay, cool, like, I'm a man now, I'll just get on with it? Or if there was then available to you the option to transition back to where you were, if you could do that, or if the alien showed up again and said, hey, do you want me to change you back? Like, would you have any inclination to change back? Would you just be like, nah, I don't care? And if you don't care, then, you know, maybe that's interesting. But I think a lot of people do care. I think if you woke up and you had changed one day, that would be interesting. It's a different way to see the world. But after a few days, after the novelty's worn off, you would start feeling uncomfortable. Everyone's treating you differently. Your body is totally different. It'd be very disorientating. And I think, you know, well, that is what gender identity is. And it's more than just me saying, imagine if there's an alien, because there's, you know, decades of research into showing that this is largely a mutable part of a person's identity. And there's, various research on that. So,
thank you. Jane has called from Richmond. What would you like to say?
Hello. It's so lovely to hear you on the radio, Katie.
Thanks.
I am the mother of a trans boy, and I think when we started this conversation, Natasha, that we were talking about, you know, women's spaces. My 18-now-year-old boy has not been able to use a public bathroom for 5 years because he identifies as male but is biologically still female, and has felt so uncomfortable and not wanting to encroach on women's spaces, but doesn't identify with himself as a woman, doesn't want to go into a male bathroom being a teenage biological female. And this whole discussion really needs to have the politics taken out of it, because exactly as you were just saying, these are people who know who they are, and who are we as cisgender people to judge what they know about themselves, right?
Absolutely.
Jane, can I ask you, as a parent, when did your son first know that he was trans?
I mean, I would imagine that Katie could probably identify this, but it was a gradual thing. I'm a relatively liberal kind of family, sort of, you know, but it's not like they wake up one day and go, ta-da!
No.
I think I always kind of knew. And it was never an issue. But then suddenly when he got onto social media, when he started secondary school, I started to realise that he knew that the way that he was not what everybody else expected. And that's kind of when it got harder.
Jane, you said that it's difficult to be the mother of a trans person.
Oh, no, it's a privilege.
I didn't mean your relationship with your son, but I meant in the kind of broader context of everything that's happening at the moment in media. Do you think that does that make you scared? I think it would me if I was the parent of a trans person.
I think being a parent in general isn't the easiest thing you can do. But, I think particularly in today's political landscape, it's harder than it probably should be, as far as I'm concerned. They're just kids. They're just kids. They're
And
just the same
I
as
think-
everybody else's kids.
I think some, like you were saying at the start there, like they are just people, and that is lost. And I know that lots of the people who are sort of debating trans people's lives and rights might be like, I know they're human, of course. But that isn't how we're considered. It's so dehumanising.
Absolutely, Katie, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is the sadness of all of this, because people are making like demons out of like this weird man that might turn up in a toilet. That man could turn up in a toilet whether he had a gender recognition certificate or not.
Exactly, and they do that already, and they don't need to get a certificate. It's already a thing. Yeah, totally agree. And it's also always a discussion between cis people. I mean, whenever I say, I'm doing this thing, like, I'm coming on LBC, most of the replies I get are from trans people saying, wow, that's so exciting, there's a trans person talking about trans rights. And like just in the Holyrood debate we just saw, hundreds of how many politicians there were to discuss that, and they had listened to trans people, at least some of them, but every single person there is cis, and that all of the reporters are, just everyone, and it just means that there's just layers of dehumanization, and yeah, I just feel like sometimes people say things to me or about me in front of me that they wouldn't say to an animal. It just is so extreme.
Dehumanisation, Katie.
Yeah.
That is exactly how. And, I've got 2 other children who are younger. I don't feel any differently about my son than I do about the other 2. But my son is talked about very differently by friends, family, wider networks. It's not right.
Jane, I'm sorry to hear about the struggles that you've had, and thank you so much for picking up the phone. I really appreciate it. If you have got a question for Katie, if you have got a legitimate concern about what these changes to the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland might mean for women's rights in particular, based on something that you have perhaps read or seen in other corners of the media, this is why I brought Katie in, because she knows of what she speaks and she will be able to give you the information in an unbiased and objective way.
So, what the fuck was the first caller of that section? There are sometimes cis people who will ask, what is this gender identity thing, or what is a trans person? Like, some people, and sounded like an older man, I've literally never encountered this idea at all before. And I get that there are some people who are ignorant, and as a trans person it can be tiring, and even when they say these offensive things, like, you're just like, oh, fuck off. But I have a lot of energy for this, and if someone genuinely doesn't know, then I'll explain it to them like a child if they're happy to listen. So that's kind of what I went with on the start of it. And then he was just like, what about the 1912, whatever, no, the 1200. I just looked up, actually. So this is actually from, like he said, 1267, Statute of Marlborough. Set of laws from King Henry III, and of which 4 are still in force. So that's exciting. 4 out of 29 chapters. The oldest piece of statute law. So he was right. He had obviously at least read the Wikipedia page, or who knows. But I was just trying to work out what this actually does. And I don't really know. Like, there's a section here. I mean, there's all kind of... Chapter 4 makes it illegal to distress outside of debtor's county. This one, which seeks to govern the recovery damages or distresses and make it illegal to obtain such... What are you talking about, mate? Like, how is this related to trans people? What I thought, what was going on in my mind at the time was like, is he going to try and bring... Like, you never know when someone's like, what actually is a trans person? Whether they're just some confused person who doesn't really know, and that's cool, and then you can teach them. Or whether they're a gender critical person and they're lying. And they're lying with the intent of then trying to, like, bring in something and trying to trip you up. And that's always could have been a thing. And when he started talking about some ancient law and saying, that I was thinking maybe it's to do with inheritance, and that is something gender critical people sometimes bring up. They sometimes say, oh, well, the gender recognition certificate means that someone who used to be a boy or a man now is treated as a woman in all respects in law, apart from for peerage, which is where if your father is a baron or all these other stupid titles we have in the UK, then normally a woman couldn't thing on the screen. Normally a woman couldn't inherit the father's title, but trans people still can. And like, they sometimes bring that up as if it's a dunk, like, trans people, they want to be, trans women want to be women most of the time, but as soon as they're an heir of a baronship or a lordship or whatever, like, no. I mean, there might be some super upper class trans people who want to keep their peerage bullshit, but that isn't, firstly, that probably affects no one in the country, or maybe it affects one person in the country, and that's why they put this law in place. But like, the vast majority of trans people who I have encountered don't think there should be lords at all. I don't think there should be any hereditary power anywhere in the world for anything. That is my position, not just as a trans person, not just as a feminist, but as a British person who is stuck in some country where we don't really have democracy. We still have a flipping king. Or maybe we had a queen at the time of this recording. I don't know. But yeah, like, sometimes they try and use it as a dunk. It's just completely rubbish. Like, get rid of it. I do not mind if, when we reform the Gender Recognition Act, which still probably will happen eventually, if you include a little bit that says trans people can't inherit peerages, I'll let you have. That would be transphobic, because it would be specifically singling out trans people. But I don't care, because peerages are a load of bullshit. Anyway, the second caller of that section. It's always good to hear from parents of trans kids. I feel like trans kids are in a situation where it's very difficult for them to say their problems. Lots of trans kids don't have any support of any kind. But even those who do, in one sense, humanizing trans kids is strategically the best thing to do. The more trans kids we can get in front of like cameras, talking to people and saying, hey, look, I'm just a normal kid, leave me alone, that will win a lot of people over. But the problem is that it's such a high cost to that child's life, because firstly, them outing themselves in the moment is dangerous. It could, damage their relationships at school. It could affect their education. There are loads of gender critical teachers, and they'll be, treat this child worse. And it could affect all that kind of stuff immediately. It put their parents in danger. I mean, in some places, like, some of these states in America are trying to make it so if a trans kid is outed and they said themselves, in front of the national news, I'm a trans person, then the parents might even get arrested. They might get separated from the family. Horrific. But also, if you're a trans kid and you come out publicly like that, you can't go back in the closet. There will always be that recording of you on BBC News one time or on LBC Radio of you outing yourself, and maybe you don't want, it's too big a decision for a kid to make, especially a young child. If a 17-year-old's making it, it's very different. But if you're like a 10-year-old and you think, I want to do something for trans rights, and you out yourself, by the time you're 18 or 21, you might be like, I wish I'd never done that. And you can't take it back. And that's why there are some trans kids who are activists, and I support them, and I think they're great and amazing and stronger than I would have ever been at that age. But if anyone said to me, my child wants to do this, or a kid said to me, I want to do this, I would really strongly try and talk them out of it, just for their own lives' safety. Anyway, it's difficult. It's good to hear from a trans parent. You could tell that she was very emotional about it. I don't know how parents of trans kids are dealing with this. I mean, in one sense, it is worse to be a trans person. I'm not trying to say, cis people have it the worst. But like, when this is happening, it's happening to me, it's happening to my friends. I feel stressed at this stuff happening to, trans people, because it affects me. But when I think about trans kids, it makes me feel sick, or so angry, or so upset that they're harming these children. And if it was my child, I don't know how I could handle it. It would be too much. People always get defensive over their kids, and I think it's a totally normal reaction. But yeah, well done for her calling in. So we've had some interesting callers so far. Let's see what's next.
It's 3:34, and if you've just joined us, we've got Katie Montgomery in the studio, who is here to answer any questions that you have about the changes to the Gender Recognition Act, ultimately, that happened in Scotland last week. But it's kind of turned into a bit of a broader phone-in than that. We're discussing really any kind of concern or confusion that you might have about the so-called trans issue. There's a great book actually by Sean Fay called the Transgender Issue, which addresses a lot of this stuff if you do want to do some more research after this. Something that strikes me is I often hear people that say that there is a concern of contagion. They think that people are picking up the idea that they're trans from social media, for example. I always think of the first time I ever heard the word bisexual, and I was like, oh, there's a word for what I am. Before then, I just thought, I don't think I'm gay, but I also don't feel straight.
Yeah.
You know, and then suddenly I had a name for what I was. Do you think that it's just that people have more access to information now?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't really know what a trans person was until like my 20s, I guess. I knew that something, I knew that I wanted to be a girl when I was like 6 or 7. But I also, my only contact with anything like this was the word transsexual, and I just knew that was bad. I mean, that's all I knew. And so I thought, well, I'm not bad. I'm not a horrible person, so that's not me. And it took, kind of just seeing a trans person, learning what the word really meant, and learning that they were just normal like everyone else for me to realise, oh, that is me. That does describe me. And I think, we see this across history with all kinds of different things that people learn they are, and not just LGBT people, but also, people who are autistic or ADHD and other things. They have something in their life and they realise maybe they're not quite the same as everyone else. And then you hear the word and they're like, oh, this is what this word means. And you're like, wow, that describes me. And that doesn't mean that suddenly you've got, there's more autistic people now because everyone knows about the word. It just means everyone knows about the word.
The other thing that they do, when I say they, I mean the tabloid newspapers mainly, is they talk in percentages rather than numbers.
Right.
So they'll say there's been a 2,000% increase, and they never mentioned that, okay, but we're starting from zero though.
Yeah.
Because this didn't exist before.
When they're talking about, particularly with trans kids getting healthcare, they're always talking about 4,000% increase. But yeah, this has gone from, tens to like hundreds a year of kids who are getting diagnosed and prescribed with, transition healthcare. And yeah, they do that on purpose to be scary. I think you should, as a general point, a general critical thinking point, if you ever see someone just say the numbers or just say the percentages, look up what the other one is, because it's often to conceal things, especially when it's percentages in the thousands. It's a red flag.
Yeah, it puts things into perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Ray has called from Vauxhall. What would you like to say?
Hello, Katie. I apologies if I sound a bit ignorant about the general subject, but I have a question, which is that when you mentioned about the Hollywood judgment and how that was a very narrowly focused judgment in terms of what it covered, I was asking a general question: does the trans community that you know of, is the ultimate goal there, looking at that the definition of a trans woman should be effectively merged with the definition of a woman in general? Is the idea that there should not be a distinction between a trans woman and a woman, or a trans man and a man, and eventually you would see that there would be no distinction? Because obviously that fundamentally would be a massive shift in how we've, the social dynamic of everything operates, including the legal aspect and everything else. So that's really the question: is that the ultimate goal, and this being a step to that, or is that not really of interest of the trans community?
The ultimate goal of trans people is obviously world domination, but no, I think just I guess to clarify on that. The goal of me and most of the trans rights activists that I talk to isn't to hide the difference between trans women and cis women, or trans men and cis men. We have needs that are different to cis women. I have medication needs that are different to most women who you will meet, and my history is different. I have a different childhood to cis women who grew up as cis girls, and there are differences that we talk about, and that's why we have the words trans and cis. Like, we focus on those in order to describe them. Trans people have all kinds of extra prejudice that they face every day, and if we were to say, oh well, trans people and cis people are the same, then that would be hidden. I wouldn't be able to talk about how trans people are way more likely to be sexually assaulted or made homeless, or all of those kinds of things. So we wouldn't want to hide that. But when you say there's no difference between a trans woman and a woman, I guess this is just kind of a semantics issue, really. But how I would describe it is, there are women, and some of those women are trans, and most of them are cis. And when I say women, there might be a situation where we'd say, oh, all the women come this way, please, and all the men go this way, or, this is a women's toilet. And that includes trans women and cis women, and it doesn't include the trans men and the cis men. And you could say, oh, that seems like a really big change in definition. But actually it's not, because trans women have been women in that sense for my whole life. There have been trans women like me who have transitioned and just lived a normal life, merged into society or whatever, for longer than I've been alive. And I've actually met some of these trans women who came out in the 70s and stuff, and they just got on with it as best as they could. And it was a lot more brutal then, and there was much more pressure to pass, and passing means sort of fitting in and not being noticed as a trans person. And basically you either kind of passed or you didn't survive, really, which is kind of horrible, and that things have got better in that regard. And I think that's maybe what people more see as a change in definitions, is that now we've got to the point where trans people who don't flawlessly pass and who don't hide their history and who don't, conceal the fact they're trans have a voice and are seen. And there are trans people where you may know that they're trans from seeing them. And I think that, we've always included trans women in the definition of women, or at least in modern concepts of what they are, what those words mean. But yeah, so I can see maybe a point. I don't know. How do you feel to that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I you're right in that there must have been, and I'm sure certainly there are, various historic examples of trans men and women, even in popular culture, possibly, that maybe we not have acknowledged. But I was talking more from a more fundamental point of view, in a legal, there's a legal definition, isn't there, of factors that affect women and men. And when it was likened to the sort of the civil rights actions of the past, I can see the parallels, but obviously where you have women's rights and you have coloured people's rights in America, those things can be defined very clearly in law and in biology in some cases. But it's not as black and white, if you want to call it that, in the way you use it.
I'm not sure that there really is a definition of women or female or of race even in the law, in the Equality Act 2010, and that is because it's not really possible to do one. But I think that also importantly, there isn't just one single definition. Like for a long time, I had an F on my passport and an M on my birth certificate, and those in different contexts mean different things. If someone says, show me your ID, it said an F on it. When I travelled to another country, I was female in their every single document they could obtain from me would have said female. But if I wanted to get married in certain places in the UK, then suddenly I count as male. And that's the only real part of the definition that is changing. And even then, that isn't totally changing, because the Gender Recognition Act has already existed since 2004. So this is only changing. It's only making it easier for people who would have got one anyway, ideally.
It strikes me that the word cis just gets rid of so many of these problems. Because if we're talking about, for example, the very specific rights of people who have ovaries and a womb and are able to get pregnant, that's most cis women, although not all cis women, right? So you can look at them as a group, you can advocate for them. However, if you're talking about some of the other struggles in feminism that women face, things like harassment, for example, you and I are both equally likely to be harassed out on the street. Yeah. There are things that we have in common, and then there are needs that we have that are different, which is, I think, why some people have a problem with the word cis.
But yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that, the reason why we have the word cis is so we can talk about trans people's oppression. And so the people who don't want us talking about trans oppression don't want us to have that word. I think that's the main reason that people have an issue with that word. But certainly, and I think, the difference is, we can often say, talk about the differences between trans women and cis women. But there are differences between cis women. Yeah. There are groups of cis women who have needs that are different to all the other cis women. And if there are cis women who may be born without ovaries, or, something which would mean that they're not fertile, and, concerns about pregnancy and periods and stuff is a huge part of a lot of cis women's lives, but not all cis women. And to separate these women who don't have the, most common experience out as if there's some totally different group who, maybe they need different rights. And I think it's the wrong way of looking at it, because really we should address all these problems. Like you say, we should address misogyny as an issue. And we say, who is affected by misogynistic harassment on the street? Well, let's address that, and let's look at those people. Who is affected by misogyny in like employment and hiring, and address these issues. And luckily that is what the Equality Act 2010 does, and it already includes trans women in that. And if a trans woman is denied the chance to work a job because she's a woman and they don't think she's as good, then she could then use that law to protect herself, even if she doesn't have a GRC.
Perfect example of what I was talking about. An anonymous text has come in and said, sorry, LBC needs to get someone who does not agree with trans ideology. Natasha, you have been captured. I'm not a cis anything. This is exactly what I'm talking about. First of all, if you want to hear from somebody who doesn't agree with trans ideology, as you call it, literally go anywhere else in media and you will find it. Exactly. But also, the word cis, I think it's a privilege to object to being a subcategory of woman, because as you say, we're all a subcategory of women. I'm a woman of mixed ethnic heritage. I'm a bisexual woman. I'm a woman from Essex. There are so many parts to our identity, and cis just means that your biology at birth matches your gender identity.
Or even an easier way to describe it, because I know people can take issue with, what exactly biology counts towards the definition of sex and what exactly gender identity is. Like, if I ask you, are you a trans person? And you say no, I could either go around and saying, oh, well, all not trans people have a similar rate of, homelessness, which is different to that of trans people. Or I could just use the word cis, which that's all it means. And when I say, 25% of trans people in the UK at one point in their lives experience homelessness, but for cis people, that's less than 1%. Like, that's a really important thing to consider, because it shows the difference in, quality of life that trans people have from not trans people. It would be ridiculous. If we got rid of the word cis, I'd just have to say not trans instead.
We have Claire in Edgware waiting on the line. We will come to her in just a moment. You're listening to Natasha Devon, and the time is 3:46.
So I actually totally forgot about that caller. Interesting listening back. I think I remember at the time thinking like, oh, is this a gender critical man who's trying to get pointed in? Listening back, I don't think he was. I suspect that, maybe someone who knows a bit about the law, but not really much about what trans people are in law and how the law treats us, and could benefit from finding out. So it's good that he called in, and hopefully that communicated the points. Natasha's right about the word cis, and it's so funny getting that text was definitely from a gender critical person, and it's just so frustrating. I do feel like there are some people who are just, there's probably a lot of people who are just gut reacting to the word cis and just being like, that's not me, like, leave me alone, don't call me straight, I'm normal, that kind of thing. But I think a lot of them, that probably comes from people who are just at the edge of gender critical. The big names who object to the word cis, the reason they do it is because we need the word cis in order to describe trans liberation. We need to say things like 25% of trans people in the UK experience homelessness at one point in their lives, compared to 0.8% of cis people. But if we don't have the word cis, then it's harder to say that. It makes the whole discussion much more difficult. Ironically, highlighting the differences between trans and cis people suddenly gets much harder if you don't have a word for it. And they do want to hide these differences. This kind of idea that they're worried about trans people and cis people no longer having differences, this is one of those cases where they're making an accusation and it's an admission. What they don't want is a difference between trans women and cis men. That's what they want to make it exactly the same. But importantly, not just that. This isn't just about whether trans women are women. This is also about, for example, 2/3 of all trans people, that includes trans women, trans men, and non-binary people, experience sexual assault at some point in their life. And that's compared to somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 cis women, and 1 in 20 or something cis men. That's a big difference, not just between men and women, but between trans and cis people. And if they can say, oh no, trans and cis people are the same, we don't need those words, this is nonsense, then we can hide that whole statistic. We can hide this whole important part of fighting for trans rights. Anyway, don't need to talk about that anymore. Very frustrating. Let's get on to, I think, the last section.
It's 10 to 4 and we only have 10 minutes left with Katie Montgomery, so I'm going to stop talking and let her answer your questions. And Claire has called from Edgware. What would you like to say?
Good afternoon. Just before I get to my very harrowing point, I used to work in a transgender clinic and we did female to male. And the females would go on to the phalloplasty program and hopefully have a working prosthesis. But I remember the professor of urology and andrology saying to the medical students, the reason we call it gender reassignment is because we can give them another gender. We can't change their sex. Their sex is immutable. And I stayed within the gynecological world and I went to work in a hospital and we were the main NHS trust for Holloway Prison. And we had one young girl, very vulnerable young girl, brought in. She was severely bipolar. She had other issues. I think she was hearing impaired. But she'd been severely raped, both for another prisoner, and she was in a terrible state. And she was brought in, they repaired the tissue, and they did the best they could, tried to get her psychological help. But I remember one of the gynecologists saying, didn't anybody bother to check that her fellow prisoner had retained his penis? Because, as you know, in our world, in our definition, you can only be raped if you're penetrated. And this girl had been raped in the legal definition, but she was in an awful state. And I thought to myself, all right, better legal minds than mine. But that biological young girl had the right to be protected. She will never, ever get over what happened to her. She will never recover. She will slip into her bipolar and she will never come back. And I was so angry. I was fuming because where was that biological woman's protections? Who stood up for her? She was raped by a fellow female, supposedly prisoner.
Okay, Claire, I just have to be a little bit mindful of the time. I appreciate that there were certain details that you had to get across there, but wary of keep repeating them just because it's still the afternoon. But Katie, interested in your response to that.
Yeah, I guess first thing I say is that's a horrible story, and I'm really sorry to hear that. And you know, I can feel your emotion from that. You know, and I agree. I guess what I'd say is if in that situation there was a cis woman and a trans woman allegedly, there could have easily been two trans women there, and maybe it could have been another trans woman who was raped, and then they're in just as horrible situation. Like the fact that the victim here was a cis woman doesn't make it any different from if she was a trans woman. And if we look at like in prisons, you know, trans women are much more likely to be targeted, and in fact, particularly when they're put in men's prisons, like over half of trans women in men's prisons are sexually assaulted or raped, which is truly horrific. But that also does happen in, you know, women's prisons. I mean, the majority of sexual attacks in women's prisons are actually done by guards rather than other inmates. But also, you know, there are attacks, sexual attacks and rapes done by cis women onto other cis women. And that is also horrible. And I totally agree that we don't want a situation where any of the inmates or any of the guards or anyone that, you know, we don't want sexual assault in prisons, and it does happen and not enough is done to combat that. But one of the things we can do, and is done to some degree and maybe could be done better, is to do these a better risk assessment on the prisoners. And, you know, if you have someone who's in prison for tax fraud or some non-violent crime, just because they're a trans person, that wouldn't warrant putting them in the high security prison. Trans people aren't any more likely to be dangerous than cis people, and they are more likely to be the victims. So what we would need to do is say, does this person, whether they're trans or cis, whether they're a man or woman, have a history of violence or sexual crimes against, or have some of the indicators perhaps of maybe being a danger to other prisoners, in which case then we need to take more have more safeguarding for those people. But I can totally understand there's this kind of idea of, they locked a woman in this room with a man and then, you know, she was raped or something. And I can feel that, and that's terrifying. But also for me, the idea of I was locked in a room with some rapist is terrifying. And I feel like people don't imagine that. They always imagine the trans person as the attacker and not the victim, when statistically we're more likely to be the victims. And I guess my last point I would say to this is, there are so few trans prisoners in the country. The Ministry of Justice, in some Freedom of Information Act, only said they were aware of 120 something. There are so few that we're able to case by case analysis these people, maybe more thoroughly. Ideally, we'd case risk analysis every prisoner very thoroughly, because we don't want any situations where anyone's going to hurt anyone else. But with trans people, and especially ones who might want to move prison, we can just do a very thorough analysis on them, but not count them being trans against them. Just look at their history and who they are. And all we can ever do is minimize risk. Even if we were to ban all trans women from all women's prisons, trans women have a terrible life in prison, and they would almost be, condemned to being sexually assaulted. But that still wouldn't cure this problem for cis women. There would still be cis women who are being raped and attacked by the guards and the other prisoners. And so we should just be working statistically to reduce this for everyone, rather than trying to come up with a scenario and fearmonger about trans women.
I should say as well that statistic that you quoted, I also saw that data from the government. And the reason that I saw it was because I read an article, I was researching an article I was writing, where a tabloid newspaper estimated the number of transgender prisoners at more than 10 times the amount that's in the government data. And they actually linked to the government report in the article. I have yet to find an explanation for that exaggeration, other than the fear-mongering that you described.
Yeah, I mean, if the number is lower than we'd expect, if trans people and cis people committed crimes at the same rates, then we would expect more than 120 trans people in prison. And it's possible they can commit crimes, or they are not committing crimes but are, incarcerated at a higher rate than cis people because of systematic injustice in the prison system and the justice system against trans people. And that's certainly true for, other minority groups. But we just don't have the data. But to suggest there might be 10 times, it just seems ludicrous. It's just off the top of someone's head, really, isn't it?
Just got time for a very quick question from Beth in Glasgow. What would you like to say?
Hi, Natasha. Thanks for a lovely show. My question is with this bill passing, and passing quite overwhelmingly, does this sort of mark the beginning of the end for the gender critical movement, not just in Scotland maybe, but potentially the UK?
Right, yeah. I've been thinking about this a lot. So I guess for anyone who doesn't know, the gender critical movement, or gender critical, is kind of like the politically correct term for the anti-trans movement in the UK. And they're kind of characterised, and separate maybe from other anti-trans movements, say in the US or Australia, they're characterised by kind of trying to appear as feminists and coming at opposing trans rights from a sort of feminist position. And I would argue that none of their arguments are actually feminist. They just kind of have a feminist kind of cloak to them to conceal their views. But they have a lot of media influence and in the government. And I think just by coincidence, they put all of their eggs in the gender recognition basket. And they've been fearmongering this. This has been their flagship issue for years. And they've been talking about men and women's spaces and all this kind of, stuff that we addressed earlier in the programme is kind of rubbish. And when they pass this bill, nothing's going to happen like it's happened in all of the other 18 plus countries that it's already passed in. And so what will they be able to do? Well, they'll be able to carry on fear-mongering about the UK one, but that's going to be much harder when the Scotland one's passed. I think they're going to have lost a lot of momentum, but they still have a lot of money and a lot of media influence, and they still have the Conservatives in power in the UK. So don't get your hopes up.
Katie, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I appreciated it so much.
So that first caller of that section was pretty extreme. I don't know if you noticed, there was actually a little jump cut in the middle. That wasn't me. I haven't edited anything out of this other than the adverts. That was LBC, who live, I guess there must be a couple of seconds delay or something, edited out a whole section where she just really viscerally described a sexual assault, the rape that she was talking about, in a lot of detail, which was it's when anyone says that to you, it's very triggering and it's horrible, and to kind of have to deal with that, knowing that there are thousands of people listening, come and having an answer, and it's almost like, I mean, that was obviously a gender critical caller. She said all of the things, like she kept saying things like biological girl and all this kind of stuff. She was obviously gender critical. Knowing I had to respond in a way that people could see, and like, everyone's judging me for the trans response and all this kind of stuff, and she's kind of calling in and saying, this is your fault, even though it's nothing to do with me and nothing to do with the Gender Recognition Act. And it's very difficult to come up with an answer on the fly, not because there isn't an answer. I mean, obviously, how I did answer, I think, was reasonable, to point out that, trans people are more likely to be the victims of this. Banning trans women, like they recently did in the UK, banning trans women from women's prisons doesn't make anyone safer than a case-by-case risk analysis. Not at all. It makes the lives of those trans prisoners significantly more dangerous. Doesn't affect the cis people because we're already doing the case-by-case analysis. So it's just kind of a garbage situation where, I mean, this is the gender critical strategy. I almost felt like, I mean, she could have been doing it intentionally or by accident, but when you say something so horrific, like describing this really horrific sex attack in detail, anyone's emotions are raised at that point. You're already moving out of your rational zone into your emotional zone, and you could sense that that's where she was. It gets people in the emotional zone, and then you conjure this image of like a trans woman raping this poor girl, and people's brains switch off because you're in this, I mean, understandably. But this is like the strategy the gender critical movement uses. We say, the Gender Recognition Act, is just about marriage and death and taxes. And then they describe this horrific sex attack and then say, this is the fault of trans people. It's not, and that isn't why that's happened. And, has this even happened at all? Certainly never seen it described in any gender critical literature before, this particular one. And you would think you've heard of it, but maybe not, But then people just panic and they say, yeah, right, we're going to ban it. We're going to ban trans people. It doesn't matter. You're like, well, what are you talking about? This has nothing to do with the thing we're talking about. This is, it wouldn't stop the situation anyway. Like, it's just so nonsense. But people act in their kind of emotion brain zones rather than the logic brain. Frustrating. But I don't know. Let me know how you think I did in that situation. Hopefully it was okay. And the last caller of the whole episode, kind of now knowing what we know, only just a couple of months later, knowing that the UK government overruled Scottish democracy just to block this one small law, which doesn't really do anything, is just totally ridiculous. But if anything, that shows the gender critical movement that the far right government we have in power are totally on their side. Like they have the biggest the nuclear option available to them. If anyone is to pass a pro-trans law, the highest level of government is prepared to step in and with no justification at all, no reasoning, no legal arguments, nothing, just say, no, we're not having trans rights today. And that will make them feel more empowered. Like it does with any bully. If someone's bullying some kid and then the teacher steps in to back up the bully's just going to feel invincible. And that's just, identically the same situation with the gender critical movement. If the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland had passed, I think what I said there would have been true. I think that we would just be hearing some other fear-mongering bullshit now. If the landscape would be identical, there would be 100 and something more trans people in Scotland with a gender recognition certificate, and other than that, today's world would be exactly the same. So I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, that was the show. One last thing I will say about it, looking at the picture of me and Natasha in the studio, that chair I'm on is actually bolted to the floor. I don't know if I'm allowed to tell this story. I hope so. I hope LBC doesn't get angry at me saying this story, but chair was bolted to the floor and I tried to move it and they were like, oh yeah, that's bolted to the floor. We call that the Boris chair because they interviewed Boris Johnson in it a lot. And the microphone is obviously in a specific position. As you may know, it's quite difficult to get the sound right for recording people. And apparently he used to just keep wheeling his chair backwards and getting further and further from the mic, so the sound would get worse and worse. So they bolted it to the floor just so he couldn't do that. So that's quite funny. But it meant that I was kind of stuck in place. But maybe that was for the best for me too, because I'm also a fidgeter. So Me and Boris have that in common. Anyway, there's it for this episode. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that you think I did quite well. I know it's a little bit out of date now, but I think it was still quite interesting to see what kind of calls you get on a national radio show. I would love to do more of that on any other radio channel, or go back on LBC, cover other trans topics, maybe have some more confrontational callers. I just feel like that kind of thing. I know this is maybe the main discussion I want from this, is I know a lot of LGBT rights activists are kind of opposed to engaging with the media because it's so anti-LGBT. And LBC does have some rubbish hosts. But obviously not all of them, and lots of them are good. And, Natasha's great. Natasha is pro-LGBT, being an LGBT person herself, but even the neutral ones, and maybe even the negative ones, in the right situation, in this kind of context, I think that was net positive, though I'm happy to hear arguments against it. And I think I and we should do more of this kind of thing if the situation arises. I actually got this opportunity because I can't actually remember who it was now, but they had a gender critical person on LBC do like a call-in show. Maybe it's Helen Joyce, I don't remember. And I said, I just tagged LBC on Twitter and was like, have me on. I'll do an hour-long call-in show. Let's go. And, great that Natasha's a great person and was like, let's see if I can make this work. And she was like, I don't know when she managed to get this work. Basically, I got a text on Christmas Day being like, do you want to come to London tomorrow and record an hour-long call-in show in front of thousands and thousands of people? I was like, I guess. It was kind of stressful deciding on Christmas Day when I was relaxing with my family, deciding whether I was going to travel halfway across the country and sort this out. But I did it. I'm really glad I did it. I think it went well. I would love to hear feedback. But yeah, thank you very much for watching this episode of Turf Wars. We'll be back as normal live next week at 9 p.m. Monday, and we'll have a new episode for you. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you all soon.